successfully recovered from whatever plague we had in the Panliner household. So thanks to all the catechists and all you guys for dealing with that a couple weeks ago. I saw some pictures of Advent wreaths, and they were beautiful. I'm sorry I missed it. So today, we're going to dive right into part 2 of what I talked about, that's got to be a month ago now, right? Oh my gosh. Jesus' role as prophet. We talked about him a little bit as priest, our high priest, and now we're going to dive into his role as prophet. How does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament model of prophets? What great expectations does he fulfill? And why does it matter that he fits this idea? First, I had a couple of questions from last time that I wanted to address because we didn't have time to talk last time. I talked way too much. That's why we divided this into 3 pieces. This was originally supposed to be parts 1 and 2. We extended it into 3, not because I like to hear myself talk, but because I talk too much. So this time, you guys will have a chance. Question 1 was basically, Jess, how do I trust that you know what you're talking about? So my qualifications, basically, my undergraduate degree is in religious studies from the Center for Jewish Studies at UW-Madison. And I have a master's degree in historical theology from Marquette, specializing in the Second Temple period. That's about King Cyrus to 70 AD. Okay, so I do know a little bit of what I'm talking about. The second question was, do the Jews still wait for Messiah? And in answering this question, I want to remind you guys that I am not now, nor have I ever been Jewish, okay? If you ask 5 Jewish people this question, you are going to get 6 or 7 different answers, okay? You laugh, but it's true. So when I answer questions about, do the Jews think this, do the Jews do that, take a grain of salt that I'm not Jewish. I cannot speak for them, right? But in general, yes, the Jewish people are still awaiting a Messiah. If you go to a Passover Seder in a Jewish household, you'll see that there is an empty seat at the table with cutlery, a plate, the glasses of wine, and they set a place for Elijah. Because in general, we're waiting for Elijah to come back. Elijah was assumed into heaven in the book of Kings. So in general, we're kind of waiting for Elijah to return and be Messiah, okay? All right. So in his book, Jesus of Nazareth, is my head in the way? I feel like my head's in the way. Okay. Pope Benedict XVI wrote, "The book of Deuteronomy contains a promise that is completely different from the messianic hope expressed in the other books of the Old Testament. The object of this promise is not a new David, but a new Moses. Moses himself is interpreted as a prophet." So the last big discussion we had was about Jesus as, new David. The final and unique high priest. We talked about the Davidic kingdom as a reflection of the heavenly kingdom. And therefore, Jesus modeled the structure of the church off of these things. Jesus is the high priest in line of David. His mother Mary is the queen, because in those days the Israelite queen was not the wife or wives of the king, but it was his mother. And the Pope is the royal steward who holds the keys to the kingdom, and then the bishops serving the citizens of the kingdom, the laity, okay? But before all of this, before we get to David, we read Deuteronomy. You're going to see a lot of art in this style. This is one of my favorite painters. His name is Mark Chagall, and he did a lot of work on Moses. So we read in the last book of the Torah, the culmination of Moses' life. He's so incredibly important to the Jewish people that he's referred to as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses the rabbi. That's a title that's not used lightly. He spoke to God in the burning bush. He was given the divine name. You can see it, up there, Yahweh. He spoke to God in the burning bush. He led the people out of Egypt to Sinai. He bonded their flesh and blood to God through sacrifice. And tradition says he brought us the first 5 books of the Bible because he spoke with God on the mountain face to face. The veil that covered his face when he came down from the mountain was not to shield Moses from God, but it was to shield the people from the radiance of Moses' face after he had seen the beatific vision. And Moses tells Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, "You shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of the nations." There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, or anyone who practices divination, a soothsayer, an augur, etc., etc., etc. It goes on. Everyone around the Israelites practiced these things. It was normal. I don't have to tell you why child sacrifice is an abomination, I don't think. Trying to see into the future is an abomination to God because it's opposed to a life of holy and humble faith. We control a lot in our own lives, but the future should be one realm that we can't exert complete control over, right, as much as we try. But these forbiddings were hard because these things, divination, soothsaying, what have you, those are the things that the people knew as prophecy. Because even though Israelites and pagans used the same word for prophecy, in practice they weren't the same things. So this was really something unheard of for the Israelites. They had to learn what prophecy meant in God's context. So it was in this context, the condemnation of what the people until now knew as prophecy. Moses comes down from the mountain. He tells you, you can't divine things. You can't be a soothsayer. And they're probably sitting here thinking, but you just called yourself a prophet. What else is there? Same word, different practices. And it's in this context that Moses speaks a promise in Deuteronomy 18. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you. He says to the people, this is the true prophecy of God. It's different. It's strange, but it's good. I am God's prophet, and someday you'll have another one like me. This is the prophecy that the Pharisees are referring to when they confront John the Baptist and they ask him, are you the prophet? They're saying, are you the prophet that Moses promised us? Oops. Sorry. This verse in Deuteronomy was followed by warnings against false prophets. They were to be dealt with harshly. False prophets just would not last. They're going to be seen through, they're going to be dealt with. But the promised prophet would survive and always be under God's protection. That promise of a new prophet is not mentioned again until the end of Deuteronomy 34, right after Moses has died and is buried. Since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Because the greatness of Moses wasn't due to his miracles or his deeds or his words because he had a stutter, but to speaking to God as a friend face to face. A prophet shows us the face of God and the path we need to take toward him. Benedict XVI says again, a prophet points out the path to the true exodus, the path to God, the true direction that we must seek and find. So if we remember back to the 4 great expectations of the Messiah, gather the tribes, cleanse the temple, deal with Israel's enemies, reign as the Lord of the nations, there's a theme that surrounds all 4 of these things, and that's the expectation of a new exodus. Among first century Jews, it was believed that one day God would save his people in the same way he saved them from Egypt. And that was like the climactic historical moment to the Israelites. That exodus led by Moses, begun by the Passover, it was the moment around which everything else was compared. Since that moment was like the rubric, there was this hope that when the age of final salvation dawned, God would recap and repeat and elevate the events from the first Exodus into a second, greater Exodus. And the essentials of that new Exodus can be summarized by the coming of a new Moses, the making of a new covenant, the building of a new temple, and the journey into a new promised land. Jesus deliberately sought to fulfill these, so he must have had an amazingly organized mind to keep track of all these things. So after the first Exodus, let's remember that there were 2 major devastating disasters to the Israelites. 722 BC, the 10 northern tribes under King Ahab are hauled off by Assyria, and they're never seen again. They're lost to the nations around them. And then in 587, Judah and Benjamin are taken into exile by Babylon. Solomon's temple is destroyed, and it's in this context that we find the writings of the prophet Ezekiel. And so it appears that the promise of a promised land is shattered twice, but this hope of a new Moses persists. Because it makes sense that exile would lead to exodus, right? That's what happened in Egypt. Like Moses before him, the Messiah would be sent to Israel in a time of desperate need. The first covenant was sealed with the blood of sacrifice in a banquet on Sinai. The new Exodus, was expected to have the same, a covenant sealed with a sacrifice and with a meal, but this time with a covenant that could never be broken. The first covenant was on Sinai, where the people were instructed how to worship. Because the Exodus wasn't really like a real estate grab or even as much of a delivery from slavery, it was really about the Israelites' fundamental right to worship God in an orthodox way. So goes the second Exodus, where people are granted eternal freedom. What we didn't expect was that that covenant would be forged on another mountain, Mount Calvary. So 1,000 years after Moses, Jeremiah is prophesying in Jerusalem during the Babylonian exile. He proclaims, "Behold, the days are coming. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt, a covenant they broke. I will put my law within them. I will write it upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people." That new covenant comes with an ontological change in the essence, the reality, the being of a very person. Like the irrevocable seal put on a soul at baptism, maybe? I don't know. Both covenants involve the 12 tribes. Despite the exiles, the new covenant would be with all 12 tribes because 12 represents fullness of all the world. Just as on Sinai, the 12 tribes were covenanted to bring the rest of the nations to the Lord, so were the 12 meant to gather the universe in at the new Exodus. And if 12 sounds significant, it should, because everything Jesus did was on purpose. He chose the 12 apostles for a reason. And they understood how important it was to have 12 apostles after Judas's betrayal and death. So enter St. Matthias in Acts chapter 1. Now here comes a new temple. We went from the tent of meeting / tabernacle in the desert, Solomon's temple, to the second temple. Second temple, Cyrus's temple, Herod's temple, what have you. Built after Cyrus of Persia returned the Hebrews to their land from Babylon. And it just didn't compare. It didn't even come close. Ezra wrote that the old men who had beheld the splendor of Solomon's temple in their youth wept at the sight of it, how dull it was in comparison, which blows my mind because that doesn't look dull to me, does it? No, it looks fine. But thank goodness the prophet Haggai prophesies that the splendor of the new temple will dwarf even Solomon's. There's this lasting hope for a new temple at the end of the new Exodus that will exceed even Solomon. So we come to the 1st century. Tons of money, even more time, is being poured into the second temple, trying to make it one of the wonders of the ancient world. But there's a massive, unsolvable problem that no amount of time or money can fix. The Holy of Holies is empty. The glory of the Lord that left in the book of Ezekiel had not returned. Plus, the Ark of the Covenant was lost, still lost. The tradition of the bread of the presence had stopped because, well, there's no presence. Little side trip, because I hadn't heard of the bread of the presence until quite recently. It was 12 loaves of bread, baked, covered in frankincense, and put in the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. In 1 Samuel, David at some point is running for his life from Saul, and he ducks into the temple for safety. He and his men are starving, and the priest gives him and his men the bread of the presence, which is supposed to be only eaten by priests. Jesus uses that story to show us that the law was given for our benefit, and that through the Eucharist, his body, his bread of life, we're under new law, and we all partake in the bread of life that is the presence of God through our universal priesthood. Cool, right? Okay. So to no one's surprise, the Jews are eagerly awaiting a new temple. Isaiah portrays the new Exodus in the temple as a new Jerusalem, a new creation, when he prophesies, "For behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing, and Israel, her people, a joy." So the hope's beyond a mere return to the land, but a new creation. So not the first land purged and cleansed, but an entirely new creation. There's a Jewish historian named Josephus in the 1st century, and he suggests that the idea of a new Exodus was so widespread at this time that several figures promised to be able to perform the miracles necessary to bring it about. The many sign prophets modeled themselves on figures such as Moses and Joshua. A couple of them are mentioned in the book of Acts. It just proves that there was something in the air at that time. The idea was gathering steam. People were expecting a new Moses. They were trying to fulfill these messianic expectations by modeling someone after him. So this is detail from a painting by Raphael, the conversion of the proconsul, otherwise known as the blinding of Elymas. And it's from Acts chapter 13. Peter and his cohorts come upon a court where, this man, Elymas, is proclaiming to be Elijah, Moses. And he's blinded for his lies, basically. Only Jesus performs the signs that fulfill the expectations. He fasts in the desert for 40 days. Occasionally, you'll still read news articles about people trying to fast for 40 days, and it never ends well. He turns water into wine. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk, etc. He ends his ministry with the Last Supper, telling the apostles, "This is my body, this is my blood, the blood of the new covenant poured out for you." And none of the apostles would have missed that reference to blood of a new covenant poured out for you. Jesus says, look, I'm fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy, the new covenant at a time of a new exodus through my own death. And Luke brings out that importance of this exodus hope in his transfiguration account. Jesus took with him James and John and went up to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his clothing became a dazzling white. Behold, two men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. Luke chose that word for a reason. There are plenty, at least 8 that I can think of right now, plenty of other Greek words that refer to a departure or a leaving, and he chose exodus. Okay. But before that entrance into a new promised land, there's one final echo of Moses' life that Jesus acts out. So Matthew paints a picture of Jesus as a new Moses in his account of the Sermon on the Mount. Having chosen the 12 apostles, Jesus goes up onto a mountain, the New Sinai, and he takes a position of teaching authority. He withdraws from the city, just like Moses and the Israelites had forsaken Egypt to dwell in the wilderness. There Jesus sits with the 12 in the scrub, God come down to his people. And instead of inscribing a law on stone tablets, he writes it on their hearts. I once heard the Sermon on the Mount described as a theology of resistance, and I just love that so much. Jesus preaches on how to resist the world and tells us what happiness is. That was dangerous. He offers happiness that is independent of the state or the governor or of society, and that's a threat to these institutions. So this was a dangerous act. He delivers a new Torah, which is not just a set of you shall do this, you shall not do that, but it's an invitation to mission. And the Beatitudes form the heart of that prophetic teaching. They point to the entire mission, which is his saving work on the cross. And Venerable Fulton Sheen says this, he who climbed the first mountain, to preach the Beatitudes must necessarily climb the second to practice what he preached. The Sermon on the Mount cannot be separated from his crucifixion. Jesus understood his suffering and death as a sharing and fulfillment of all the sufferings of all the prophets who went before him. He suffered and accomplished what they could not. He saw to the end what the Old Testament prophets could not, and he fulfilled the sacrifice in ways that only the Son of God ever could. When Peter preaches in Acts 3 outside of the temple, he emphasizes Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection and identity as the prophet foretold by Moses, wrapping all around his passion. He says, God has thus brought to fulfillment what he had announced beforehand through the mouth of all the prophets, that his Messiah would suffer. For Moses said, a prophet like me will the Lord your God raise up for you among your own kinsmen. So calling Jesus the new Moses isn't something that we're just making up right now, okay, to legitimize our claims, or a connection that we realize much later. The very first Christians understood deeply this prophecy surrounding a new Moses and new Exodus, and they saw it fulfilled in Jesus. They saw the dangers of denying the prophet that Moses promised, the implication that that would have for someone's status as a member of the body. So it's we moderns who have lost the richness of Old Testament prophecy, unfortunately. The apostles and the writers of the New Testament presumed a level of knowledge about Judaism that we just don't have. That's nobody's fault. It's just the passage of time. St. Paul thought that Jesus would come again in his lifetime, The Gospels only started being written down around 300 AD after the church thought to herself, he's not back yet. Maybe we should start writing some of this stuff down. In no way did the apostles expect the world to be standing 2,000 years later, so why spend time explaining the intricacies of Jewish thought and religion to people following Jewish thought and religion? Does that make sense? This was supposed to be a completion of Judaism. So let's move to that final archetype, Jesus as king. Scripture's filled with references to kings. It's kind of hard to wrap our American brains around this, right? Israelite kings had a certain religious obligation to the people that seems wrong to us. If you don't know me very well, I have an evangelical Protestant background. I became Catholic in college. And when you grow up evangelical Protestant, you're very American. And so we're uncomfortable with Jesus as king because we're uncomfortable with kings, right? We like democracy. And while kingdom of God is not used explicitly in the Old Testament, this idea of eternal kingship is still expressed. So in Exodus 15, Moses declares the strength and might of God as king. Your right hand, O Lord, magnificent in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In your great majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You loosed your wrath to consume them like stubble. That's kingly language. That's language that ancient people used to describe their king on earth. Later, King David writes in Psalm 145, God's kingdom is an everlasting one whose dominion endures forever because he is faithful and gracious. The theme of that everlasting kingdom is prominent all over the Psalms, even if it's not explicitly mentioned, like kingdom of God. So that's important that David, the king, the psalmist, is writing these things because David is the king that Israel expected the Messiah to be modeled after. Jesus models his kingdom on earth after the Davidic kingdom, which will reflect the heavenly one. We touched on that a little bit earlier. God is praised as king in many passages for liberating and guiding the people at key moments. The Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea, those are obvious examples. The entire Song of Moses in Exodus 15 is a declaration of God's strength and power and majesty. And it's quite beautiful language. This is how ancient people spoke of their earthly kings, who are often seen to be gods, so they're God kings. This is how people in the ancient world talked about their God kings. By the 1st century BC, Israel is this enslaved and harassed and exiled and conquered little nation. In the words of Nathanael in John 1, can anything good come from Nazareth? I love this icon. Do you see his face? How tired does he look? He looks just annoyed. He's jaded and he's tired and he's world weary. And does this look like somebody who has time for nonsense to you? No. The people bitterly recall the Davidic kingdom. It was the high point of their nation, how far they've fallen from glory, because it's not just a political problem, it's a theological problem. We can't be what we're called to be if the kingdom is not in place, whether politically or theologically. And the cure for that problem was the third expectation of the Messiah, that he would deal with Israel's enemies. So that's just a little teaser about part 3. I'm going to cut it off here. Part 3 is going to really dive into Jesus's kingship and the last 2 expectations, that he would deal with Israel's enemies, that he would reign as Lord of the nations. So to sum up today, really quickly, the foundations of Jesus' priesthood and prophethood are found in King David and the Old Testament prophets, like Ezekiel. I've mentioned him a couple times. He's kind of my favorite. His work with John the Baptist has signaled that the tribes are being gathered. He's started to cleanse the temple by driving out the thieves and the money changers, and he shares his own body as our last temple. But his ownership of a prophetic office also comes from Moses, who sadly doesn't get as much attention. It's Moses who is permitted to speak the divine name. He sees the face of God, and he speaks to him like a friend. It's Moses who gives the Torah on a mountain and bonds the flesh and blood of his people to their God. It's Moses who frees people from their bondage and promises that one day we'll see another Moses, we'll see another prophet like himself, who sees God's face, who gives a new law, who speaks to God intimately and reconciles the gap between God and humanity, so that one day we can do it too. He promises one day there will be a prophet that leads us through the Exodus to true freedom in God. St. Peter saw it and preached it, and it's time we do as well. So over time, we've lost it. I hope this gives a little bit of new life and understanding to your Advent. I wanted to finish this today, but we, caught the plague. So we're going to finish this on January 2nd, which is still the Christmas season, so I'm okay with it.